What a marvelous age we live in.
The 1920s, an era that is generally known in the United States as a time of prosperity. The 20s are remembered as a time when America climbed out of the trenches and on top of the world stage as the most prosperous nation in the world. Where America had been and where it was headed are the most important things we will explore in our study of the 1920s. Life during the 19-teens was dominated by the Great War. World War I, as it would later be known, took 4 long years. Some 10 million soldiers lost their lives on the battlefield, and another 20 million people perished off the battlefield. So there was new hope in the year 1919, but this hope was quickly dashed as the world became gripped by an influenza epidemic by February of 1919. Once again, the United States was not immune. The flu claimed some 500,000 American lives. More than the war claimed, and in a far shorter span of time. Millions worldwide lost their lives. To make matters worse, a global recession had struck the U.S. hard. The U.S. economy struggled to recover from the wartime budgeting errors and from the inability of Europe to continue to trade with the U.S. at the pace it had during the war. As a result, union workers organized to strike. Working-class laborers were frustrated by their lack of purchasing power and their inability to keep a roof over their heads and food in their families' mouths. It seemed as though frustration would soon boil over as organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, and the American Socialist Party were gaining support en masse. And at the same time, supporters were watching leaders of these organizations being thrown into jail. Sit-in strikes, marked by non-violence, were the preferred method of showing discontent. The common man, the World War I veteran, the laborer had all lost faith in American leadership. So what would make the 1920s remembered as such a prosperous era in United States history? By 1920, the U.S. government had put down these strikes to the point where mass rebellion was no longer a threat. The status quo had prevailed for the most part. Your task now is to take 5 minutes to complete this document. It's called a Means End Analysis Organizer. After all, the 1920s were the only time between 1900 and today that the U.S. had seen the dollar actually gain purchasing power. This means that you can buy more with less. There were some concessions made during the 1920s. In 1920, women were given the right to vote via the 19th Amendment. The Jazz Age was upon us, and minority groups, particularly African Americans, enjoyed for the first time truly mixing in with and entertaining the general public. blacks became a part of this new pop cultural phenomenon that was growing via grassroots in America. Free public education became an important part of American life, touching almost everybody. More students were entering schools and graduating from high schools than ever before, more so than anywhere else in the world. The 20s were the decade where getting a high school diploma became the new normal in America. Colleges were growing. Community colleges sprung up in every state. Women and minorities gained more access to these colleges for the first time. The 20s were the decade when college education first took off in America. So the 20s became known as the age of prosperity. Others call it the Roaring 20s. But was it roaring for all Americans, or even most Americans? Was this newfound purchasing power going to last? It was an era that took advantage of previous innovations in industry, retail, and entertainment. It rode on the coattails of wartime advancements and even advancements of earlier industrialization. The 20s were defined by optimism, perhaps too much of it, but for a while, it was a good ride. Consumerism was born in the 1920s. This is the idea that buying or consuming goods is desirable for everybody. Flappers became the new brand of young women who enjoyed their right to vote, to go to school, to party, and a newfound sense of freedom. They played a large role in the development of the new consumer culture as they were interested in fashion. Retail department stores, the early form of malls, sprang up to sell items to these new consumers. For the first time, people could buy clothes off the rack at stores. Everyone could look fashionable as clothing became more affordable now that it did not have to be fitted. Clothes were displayed by size, and mannequins displayed the newest fashions. New innovations in consumer products like refrigerators and vacuum cleaners made people's quality of lives better. These consumer advancements established the U.S. as having the highest standard of living in the world during the 1920s. The automobile industry boomed. Henry Ford perfected the assembly line, and he made cars more affordable. Millions of Americans were able to begin vacationing because of these advancements. With all the newly educated Americans, there grew a new middle class. These middle-class Americans found their way into the new management positions. They moved from the country to nearer to the cities for management jobs. This consumer middle class took vacations, bought cars, had nice appliances, and found a fondness for being entertained. Entertainment prospered as well. Americans became infatuated with the moving picture, or movies, as we know it today. Movie palaces became common in all of America's cities. They were built like palaces, and movies accompanied by orchestras would entertain people of all walks of life for hours. Movies seemed to bring America together. It gave it an identity. Sports like baseball, America's pastime, became popular. Heroes were made like Babe Ruth, the New York Yankee slugger legend. Americans tuned in on their new radios and huge consumer product to hear this latest exploits. In the end, the crash did not cause the Depression. The crash was just a result of a number of problems that Americans, and its leadership in particular, did not want to face head on. There was a poor distribution of income, too few rich, and far too many poor. There was also a weak banking structure that lacked regulations. The economy depended on consumer goods that people could no longer afford to buy by 1929. There was a gross overextension of the industry, and the government blindly believed that promoting business interests would make America uniformly prosperous. This lack of uniform prosperity meant that once again, there were too many poor and too few rich.